and thank you for the opportunity to present Senate Resolution number 16. We know together, collectively, in a bipartisan fashion, that United States, our nation, is a great nation. But our history is also stained by shameful and discriminatory acts based on race and religion. We have said never again. Never again will we judge a person by where they came from, the color of their skin, their gender, or what God they worship. But here we are. Our Declaration of Independence states all men are created equal. But as we all know, that only applied to white men. The First Amendment guarantees religious freedom. Yet Jews, Catholics, and many other faiths have been the targets of hateful prejudice. Today, it's Muslims. President Trump's sweeping executive order aimed at keeping Muslims out of the United States is not only an affront to our Constitution, it takes us back to a time of government-sanctioned discrimination that at the time was deemed to be okay, legally. And here we are again. In the 1840s and the 1850s, the Know Nothing Party rose to prominence on a platform that opposed immigrants and Catholics. The Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 was the first significant law to restrict immigration into the United States. And by the way, the Chinese Exclusion Act originated right here under this dome before it became federal law in Washington, D.C. The Exclusion Act spurred later movements for immigration restriction against others considered, quote-unquote, undesirable, like Middle Easterners, Hindus, Sikhs, East Indians, and Japanese. We didn't allow Chinese residents to become U.S. citizens until 1943. After World War II broke out, our president, Franklin Roosevelt, interned more than 100,000 Americans of Japanese descent. As a nation, we have apologized for these atrocities and others. We have attempted to rectify our past with promises of never again. But here we go again. Last Friday, the president of the greatest nation on earth, Donald J. Trump, signed an executive order that desecrates our country's core values. It betrays the founding principle of our nation as a refuge for those escaping religious and political persecution. Even former Vice President Dick Cheney has commented that a Muslim ban, and I quote, goes against everything we stand for and believe in. That is a quote from the former Vice President of the United States, Dick Cheney. The executive order places a temporary ban on individuals from 7 predominantly Muslim countries from entering the United States. Refugees from Syria are banned for an indefinite period of time. There has never been a terrorist attack on U.S. soil by immigrants from the 7 banned countries. The 4 countries where the 9/11 terrorists came from were not listed on the ban. Instead, the executive order bans victims of terrorism fleeing the savagery, death, and destruction of the Syrian civil war. The war has claimed more than 90,000 civilian lives, and last year alone, 3,923 children died in the war, nearly 11 children a day. The executive order combines inhumanity with incompetence. It was drafted without consulting the Secretaries of Defense and Homeland Security. It has resulted in chaos, confusion, deep anxiety, and hardship at airports across the nation. Americans from coast to coast, as we have witnessed this weekend, are protesting. Here in California, San Francisco International Airport, and Los Angeles International Airport. Now, this doesn't keep us safe. It exasperates America's anti-Muslim reputation and gives terrorist organizations another recruiting tool. The executive order resurrects discriminatory immigration policies based on national origin in direct violation of the long-standing Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965. Now, the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965 is very important to note in our history, because prior to 1965, it was de jure, it was the law in the Congress of the United States that any immigration coming to the United States would be only Scandinavian extraction or Germanic or Western European. 1965 changed the complexity of the United States of America as we know it today, when the first time they allowed lawfully those individuals from African countries, from the Caribbean, from the Western Hemisphere, and other Asian nations. Prior to 1965, lawful legal residency to the United States was exclusive to only those Western European nations. 1965 changed the face of who we are today and has contributed greatly to the amazing diversity. Federal judges, as we all know, have stepped in and issued emergency stays to block the deportation of those impacted by the executive order. Colleagues, here we go again, but we cannot remain silent. Senate Resolution number 16 condemns this executive order as a discriminatory overreach that illegally targets immigrants based on their national origin and urges the president to immediately rescind the executive order. It also urges the Department of Homeland Security to comply with federal court orders and allow detained individuals timely access to legal counsel. For those reasons and more, in a bipartisan fashion, I respectfully ask for an aye vote.
Thank you, Mr. Pro Tem. Senator Hertzberg.
Permission to read, Madam President.
Without objection.
I have in my hand the 9-page executive order by the President of the United States. It's entitled Protecting the Nation from Foreign Terrorists. Pretty good objective. When you read Section 2, it says, it's the policy of the United States to protect its citizens from foreign nationals who intend to commit terrorist attacks in the United States and to prevent the admissions of foreign nationals who intend to exploit United States immigration laws for malevolent purposes. I don't know how anybody could disagree with that. Talks about the idea of protecting against anybody who would oppress Americans of any race, gender, or sexual orientation. Core values of what this country is about. But as the Pro Tem mentioned, it is always the insidious nature of any document or any congressional act or any statute or any ordinance to couch it in the terms that look like and embrace what we think are core American values. There was a great case that my dad used to always talk about called Yickwu versus Hopkins in 1889. San Francisco case, the United States Supreme Court, and basically what happened was the ordinance said if you had a wood laundry, it was against the law, but if you had a brick laundry, it was legal. Well, when you looked to the application of the law, it turns out the only people that had wood laundries were Chinese people, and the only people that had brick laundries were Anglo people. And the Supreme Court in Yickwu versus Hopkins said, the law itself is to be fair on its face and impartial in its appearance. But it looked to and stood for a hard, fast principle of American jurisprudence that says you look to the intent of the law, you look to its application, you look to its effect. And when you look at this 9-page executive order that looks legitimate on its surface, what happens is no different than what we saw in Yickwu versus Hopkins in the sense that a small group of people, based upon their religion, based upon their status, are denied fundamental rights. And so I stand here today in strong support of this resolution because it reflects the reality, the cornerstone of those principles, and is at the core of who we are. And no matter who it is, Democrat or Republican, to me it is not an issue of partisanship. It is an issue of understanding these fundamental fair values of what we're about. I think it's a smart resolution. I think it's timely, particularly given the circumstances, to stand tall for these important values. I urge your support of this resolution. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Hertzberg. Senator Mendoza?
Thank you, Madam President. We, as Americans and Californians, cannot stand by as our cherished principles are assaulted by small-minded individuals fueled by fear and cruelty. There can be no wall, no ban, no surrender to this kind of mindset. We need to think about the impact that this has on our children and our students, many of whom are here today. When the question in their mind is, what's going to happen next? What's going to happen to me or my family? America is sending the wrong message to our children and future generations. These are not the American ideals we have cherished and worked so hard to instill in our young ones. As a school teacher, I have seen how this type of rhetoric hurts our kids. It damages their self-esteem, their confidence, and their trust in those who are charged with leading this great country and our great state. I call on all Americans, regardless of party or political ideology, to oppose this travesty. We cannot turn our back on America or our state and what it stands for, and we cannot turn our back on our kids. Our hearts should break at this callous order from this president. This type of cruelty, this divisiveness based on race, religion, and fear is exactly what so many of our young service members have gone overseas to defend. Their sacrifice should not be devalued on the basis of fear or cowardice. The countries banned by the president have sent thousands of refugees to the United States. Not one of these have threatened or hurt an American life. The incidents of terror cited by the administration as justification for these actions, like the attacks on Boston and San Bernardino, were not perpetrated by individuals covered under this ban. The list is insensitive, poorly thought out, and not to mention ineffective. Today, I ask that you send a message that California will defend its principles against those who would undermine America's legal, moral, and human foundation. Many of you know many Muslims throughout our state, and many of you know many people that come from those countries that were banned through this executive order. Stand with them now, not during the good times, not only when you want to go to their events and be their friends, or not when you want to be on the floor in the rear of their chamber taking pictures with them. Now is the time for action. Now is the time to stand up. As elected officials, we cannot afford to wait any longer. I urge that you support this resolution. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Mendoza. Senator Nielsen?
Madam President and ladies and gentlemen of the Senate, over the decades, such issues have confronted America. We are the land of the free and the home of the brave. And our Statue of Liberty does stand for one of our values. We welcome the teeming masses. But we do not welcome those who would come here to harm us. We must accept. We cannot ignore the contemporary reality. Our enemies, as before, do not reside beyond our shores. Our enemies are within. There is no refuting that. They are here. They have learned a whole new form of warfare that we are not familiar with fighting. The terrorists have infiltrated us. This is not about nationality or religion or ethnicity. This is about evil people with evil intent. And their intent imperils our families and our security. And I'd venture to say that some of these individuals are residing within our state and making plans to harm us. They may have not or may be from these 7 nations, but they have committed their crimes in this state. Argue, if you will, the merit or the demerit of this particular executive order. Argue, if you will, the merit or the demerit of sanctuary cities. But if you argue against those, or for sanctuary cities, or against this resolution, then you owe to your constituents and the people of California your solution to the infiltration of the terrorists who are coming here. If we protect them in sanctuary cities or in a sanctuary state, then what do you propose be done to ensure that such individuals do not commit crimes like 991 or San Bernardino? You dare not deny that they will do it. That is their intent. Maybe these terrorists cloak their intentions in religious dogma. I don't believe that that is in their hearts. I don't believe that they are professing and acting in concert with their faith. I do believe they are evil, and I do believe they are here. President Obama took similar actions. I don't remember him getting so roundly criticized for restricting immigration from these same nations. At least he was aware that there was a problem. It does seem to me that here we are in a spirit of denial that there is a problem. And we're couching it in different terminology of discrimination. I argue it is not about discrimination. It is of protecting our families and our children from a clear and present and absolutely demonstrated danger. The timing is temporary. Well less than 100 individuals have so far been detained. And those who were temporarily inconvenienced are now moving on. We are absolutely learning about what vetting means. And when we're talking about terrorists who are trained, intensively trained, and care not about their lives, and that's the hardest kind of person to stop, is extensive vetting, intensive vetting required? I would argue absolutely. We should totally support that and protect ourselves and protect our children and applaud those who do. Our law enforcement professionals who I talk to are very cognizant of the problems that they face out on the beat. And not just from the day-to-day criminals, their routines. They're aware of the sophistication of the gangs that they now have to deal with and the looming problems posed by terrorists. How do they then, our our contemporary and our community law enforcement professionals, deal with this problem? It's a bit over their head. And it requires national vigilance and cooperation between all of the agencies. And even our national intelligence agencies and the FBI recognize there is a problem with that insidious, dangerous infiltration. Do not deny that there are killers among us. Do not ever feign to think that they will not kill. Let's just hope it's not in your community or neighborhood. But let's take action to ensure that they have the least possible chance. And one of the best ways to do that is interdict them before they get into our country. Stop them at the borders. That's what this is about. That's what vetting is about. Identifying them, learning about them through interrogation, and stopping this insidious peril that has come to visit our land. This resolution is no way to protect our wives and our children and our families. and I urge we take no such steps. I urge a no vote.
Thank you, Senator Nielsen. Senator Gaines?
Thank you, Madam President and members. So I think the question is this body more committed to defeating our president or to defeating terrorism? America's safety is the highest obligation of government, the first and unsurpassed duty of the state. That's why we have a military that is the pride of this country and the envy of the world. It's why our intelligence agencies watch over every corner of the globe. It's why we have borders, so that our enemies do not waltz into the country unchecked and unopposed. Nothing is more American than protecting America. European refugee streams are infected by opportunist terrorists. Do we want that for our citizens, or do we want caution? Do we want to invite terror to our doorstep and tell our citizens that they must live with nightclub shootings and trucks plowing through hundreds of innocents? Putting a hold on our current refugee and immigration policy is wise policy, especially from the 7 countries singled out by former President Obama and noted by the President in his executive order. These are jihadist hotbeds, failed states, and they are teeming with America's enemies. They deserve the strictest possible scrutiny. Let us always be a humanitarian country, but also a wise country, and a country that extends its care to its own citizens first. I urge a no vote.
Thank you, Senator Gaines. Senator Monning?
Thank you, Madam President. I stand in support of this resolution. I want to thank the Pro Tem for bringing it forward in such a timely manner. There's consensus in this room that we want to protect our country. We want to keep bad people with malintent out of it. The problem with this executive order, and the reason that several federal courts moved over the weekend to protect people that were facing turnaround deportation, is because it was overly broad. The president and his team, in drafting it, did not consult the Immigration Services or Homeland Security. Let me profile one gentleman who was attributed by one of our military leaders for maybe saving more American lives in Iraq than most soldiers who served in Iraq. It was an Iraqi interpreter who applied for immigration to the United States. And part of that application included attestations from battlefield commanders as to his courage, his prowess, and in recent years, the targeting of him by ISIS. It was part of the 3-year vetting that was required to provide papers to this Iraqi interpreter, who during those 3 years feared for himself and his family's life. So it was with the support of U.S. military commanders, people who had served with courage and distinction on the battlefield of a government now, Iraq, that stands as perhaps our strongest ally in the fight against ISIS. But what happened when this gentleman, this hero, entered JFK with his papers that had been the result of 3 years of serious vetting? He was treated with no respect. He was stripped of his clothing. He was put in detention jumpsuit and handcuffed. A minor inconvenience. This is what happens when you draft an overly broad, unconstitutional order. And what it does is it provokes the very people we seek to keep out of our country in their own recruiting by saying, look, the U.S. government is anti-Muslim. It is anti-Iraqi. It is anti-people based on national origin, race, and religion. And if there's any doubt about this order violating our constitutional standards, it also provides an exception for Christians. So when the administration says this isn't anti-Muslim. It is drafted with a profile of anyone who is Muslim, including a courageous hero who served our troops. He suffered not only an indignity and an inconvenience, but a total lack of respect of what he did for our troops and our government. And that treatment will be held up to those who do want to do harm to our country. Let's look at the status quo of immigration laws that were in place and put in place by the last administration. We have to be cautious about alternative facts suggesting that our borders are sieves and that we have an open door policy to anybody who might want to do harm to our country. We have perhaps the most rigorous vetting of people coming into this country. We also respect refugees. In my earlier life as an attorney, I represented refugees from war zones in Central America. The vetting that goes on for somebody to win a political asylum case is a very, very high standard. And if it's not met, that applicant is subject to deportation. And we have documentation of people who couldn't meet the evidentiary standard and who, after deportation, were killed when they were returned to their home country. So it's a tough decision-making process for our immigration judges and for our immigration courts. But that is in place, and it's part of the Constitution that our combatants fight to protect, and over 5,000 gave their lives in Iraq and Afghanistan to protect these principles that are now being thrown to the winds, denying fundamental due process and respect for the existing labyrinth of standards. Nobody is flying into Boston or New York or Los Angeles from another country, let alone these 7 enumerated countries, and walking into baggage claim to pick up their bags. If their paperwork has not been vetted, if a visa process has not been followed, they are detained and they are deported under current law. All this does is put a spotlight on Muslims and people from these 7 nations and fuels the anti-U.S. organizing that will lead to people infiltrating our borders and doing harm to our people. But I would just close with this. When you look at terrorist attacks in our nation, within our borders, against Americans, there have been more at the hands of U.S. citizens than at the hands of immigrants. So with that, members, I would urge an aye vote on SR 16, and more importantly, perhaps, as we evaluate other executive orders coming down the pipe, they should be measured against constitutional protections that will do the most to protect our national security and our humanity. I urge an aye vote.
Thank you, Senator Monning. Senator Jackson?
Yes, thank you very much, Madam President. I rise in my capacity as well as the chair of the Senate Judiciary Committee because we pride ourselves as a democracy as being a nation of laws and of a constitution that hundreds of thousands of men and women have fought and given their lives to protect, to preserve, to pass along to the next generations, to share with the rest of the world, the greatest living document of people being able to govern themselves in the history of humankind. We have a constitution. There is no one person, Republican, Democrat, anyone, who is above the Constitution of this country. And I am very concerned when I hear my colleagues talking about accusations against the president for behavior that any one of us, in looking at that Constitution and the fundamental principles of this country, would say is entitled to ignore the law. These executive orders that are coming down and particularly this executive order, is an unconstitutional violation of the fundamental First Amendment right that we all have as Americans. Congress shall make no laws with respect to the establishment of a religion or the practice thereof. That means that everybody in this country is entitled to practice the religion of his or her choice or not at all. And if we don't remember our history, let me remind you that when the Pilgrims came to this country in 1630, they came here, it was 1620. They came here a long time ago. They came here in order to practice their religion. Religious freedom was the fundamental basis upon which they came to this United States and serves as the fundamental First Amendment right that we are all entitled to. And so when we have an executive order that is not vetted, that does not concern itself with constitutional limitations, because you see, only in a dictatorship or a totalitarian state are there no rules and regulations that even the top dog must follow. In this country, I don't care whether you call him Mr. This or Mr. President, and someday maybe Madam President, nobody is above the law. You see, this is how we end up with fascism and totalitarianism. When we undermine our institutions, when we ignore the law, in this case, ignoring the Congress of the United States, which my colleagues on the other side of the aisle happen to control. And so we call upon you, at this point in time, as the last bastion, to keep this country in its democratic form with a small d, the ability for us to be able to rule by law, to honor and respect our Constitution, to be run with a tripartite system of government where we have a legislature, an executive, and a judiciary. And now I'm told the judiciary is no longer included on the White House website as one of the branches of government. This is astonishing. For me to stand here as the chair of the Judiciary Committee and have to remind all of my colleagues and myself that the right to practice one's religion or not is so fundamental. The right of freedom of the press is so fundamental. The right to be governed by facts is so fundamental. And here we are creating a rift in this country between saying, are you for security, or are you for the Constitution? They are one and the same. They are one and the same, but this Constitution has to be followed, or we will find ourselves at some point looking back at what California yet did again. When we interned the Japanese during World War II, claiming that this was protecting the Japanese or protecting against foreign invasion. The point is, of these 7 nations who are now the subject of this executive order, there hasn't been one terrorist attack by anyone from these 7 nations. Indeed, the United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, this was the home of where 9/11 came from, but they aren't part of this executive order. It is probably just a coincidence that the president has a number of business dealings with those countries. They have been exempted. Why are we picking on people who are trying to come to this country from the heartfelt, war-torn nation of Syria, where we have all had and seen and had seared in our minds photographs of dead young children who have tried to escape this absolute disaster of a civil war. And we're saying they can't come to America? If we want to talk about encouraging terrorism, this is the best way to do it. A nation of hypocrites, that is not who we are. A nation of lawlessness, that is not who we are. As someone who lost a good deal of her family in the Holocaust, as someone who is reminded that we, the United States of America, turned away a boat filled with people who were trying to escape inevitable annihilation, I cannot help but ask you to remember as I will close with reminding you that the great Statue of Liberty calls to give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free, the wretched refuse of your teeming shores. Send these, the homeless tempest, tossed to me. I lift my lamp of light, of hope, of opportunity beyond our golden shore. Our lamp, not our middle finger. I ask for your aye vote.
Thank you, Senator Jackson. Senator Skinner?
I want to thank our colleague from Echo Park for bringing this resolution before us. I think we have all observed that fear is a very easily manipulated emotion. And we are seeing it manipulated now, and I think to not good ends. It has not been my observation so far in my time in the legislature that my colleagues on the other side of the aisle have played fast and loose with the facts. Either side, for that matter. There can always be an exception, but it's been my experience that we have tried to be honest, to be truthful, to be data-based, and to be fact-based in what we've put forward and in what we've objected to. While my colleagues from the other party cannot control how the White House chooses to be less than truthful or fact-based, I hope that in this House, we would still do our best to stick to the facts. Now let me elaborate a bit on what my colleague from Santa Barbara referred to. Of the various perpetrators of terrorist acts in the United States that resulted in deaths, and we're talking 9/11, we're talking San Bernardino, we're talking Orlando, and I'll go through a few of them. Let me be specific. None of them came from the 7 countries that are in the order. The Orlando shooter, Afghan descent. The San Bernardino circumstance, the husband was an American, born in America, but Pakistani descent. His wife was from Pakistan. 9/11, as my colleague from Santa Barbara mentioned, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Lebanon, the Arab Emirates, none in the order. The Boston Marathon brothers, one was a U.S. citizen. They were both from Kyrgyzstan, but they identified as Chechen, Russian. The attack on the Marines in Chattanooga was committed by a naturalized American born in Kuwait. I can go further down the list, but I'll leave it. But none from Iraq, Syria, Iran, Sudan, Libya, Somalia, or Yemen. Now, let me bring it home. I think, like most of us, I watched in horror this weekend when I saw folks at the airports and I saw family members crying because they had family members detained. There were 5 refugees detained at SFO over the weekend, and I don't even want to refer to them as refugees. To be honest, they were 5 people that were viewed to fall under this ban. It turns out that they weren't really falling under the ban. 4 were released last night, 1 this morning. UC Berkeley has now advised all Cal students from the 7 banned countries to not travel. Even those that are out of the country right now have been advised not to return until UC can give them advice as to how to return safely. A UC Berkeley student from a banned country who had already left the country on travel is now reached out to my congressperson's office, Congresswoman Lee, to get advice on how to safely return. An Iranian student enrolled at UC Berkeley was prevented from boarding a plane back to the US. He was in Iran. And he's decided now not to return back to school this semester because of the circumstance. This panic and fear is not a benefit. It does not create safety. I urge an aye vote.
Thank you, Senator Skinner. Senator Allen.
Well, as someone who also has some familial connections with the Holocaust, I found it particularly distasteful that this order came down on Holocaust Remembrance Day, the day that we remember the victims, the 6 million victims of the Holocaust. And of course, it absolutely recalls the moment when the famous ship, the St. Louis, came to American shores and was filled with 254 Jewish refugees and was turned back, sent back to Europe, and nearly every single person on that ship ended up perishing in the camps. You know, it was a very this hit close to home for me as well, because I have a very large very large Iranian population in my district. Tehrangelis is in my district, and families were very concerned. Families who had come fleeing the oppression of the Ayatollahs and of the Iranian Revolution. I just wonder whether we would have ever been willing to do something similar, let's say, to Cuba, which is a government that has been frequently declared as a state sponsor of terror. Imagine if we were to tell all those folks who have come to the United States because they believe in America and they believe in our democracy and our freedom, just because they're originally from Cuba, and in fact actually have entirely rejected the government of Cuba. Imagine if we told every one of them that they would be subject to detention at the airports and subject to not being allowed in, even if they have a green card. We had green card holders who were denied access coming back into the country. And we have lots of stories from Los Angeles that involved grandparents. There was a 2-year-old child as well who were caught up in this whole mess. The whole thing was a fiasco. It created all sorts of challenges at our airports. We turned away Fulbright scholars. We turned away political dissidents from Iran. It was an ugly, ugly scene that is unbecoming of the United States of America. And I just want to stand in solidarity with Jacob Kemper, who was an Angelino who went down to LAX, who had served 2 tours in Iraq. He's a 35-year-old Army veteran who was disgusted by the fact that fellow soldiers, fellow Iraqis who had served alongside him, like this interpreter that was mentioned by the senator from Santa Cruz, would be turned away and treated with such contempt when they had offered everything to the United States of America.
Thank you, Senator Allen. Senator Newman.
Thank you, Madam President. I rise today in support of this resolution. Over the past few days, we've become familiar with a new phrase, extreme vetting. As you might expect from America's first reality television president, this is a clever bit of marketing designed to suggest that the existing process for vetting prospective refugees was somehow deficient in the face of certain parties' systematic overhyping and distortion of the current threat, as some of my colleagues have already noticed. By all objective accounts, this is far from true. A more accurate term for extreme vetting would be extreme cynicism, extreme selfishness, or even extreme cowardice. The new administration travel ban and refugee settlement bar is misguided, inhumane, and in fact un-American. Taking away immigrants and refugees' fundamental human and constitutional rights goes against many of our most fundamental beliefs as Americans. My district includes a concentration of Arab American businesses in an area in West Anaheim that has become known as Little Arabia. Immigrants and refugees from all over Southern California have come to see Little Arabia as a home away from home. Just as importantly, and not coincidentally, this area has become a robust center of not just culture, but economic development. This past week, I visited with Access California Services, a social service agency in Little Arabia run by a Syrian that serves the most vulnerable. Access California works to provide pathways to health and employment for immigrants and refugees in our area, and it also guides them through the citizenship process. Over the past year, the center has served clients from Iraq, Iran, Syria, Afghanistan, and East African countries like Somalia. Their organization serves refugees, including many women and children suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder from the conflicts from which they came. In considering a ban on religious groups, it's important to note that not all Muslims are Arabs, and not all Arabs are Muslims. In fact, globally, the majority of Muslims are actually Asian. Further, in the United States, Latino Muslims are the fastest growing Muslim population in America. Muslim residents of Orange County have recently experienced the highest rate of hate-related incidents of any location in this country. And yet, despite that alarming statistic, based on a recent Gallup poll, Muslims are actually more likely than any other faith group to condemn violence. All faiths share the commonality of striving for more morality and decency. I'm proud to represent a district that has such a rich diversity, both religiously and culturally. Our Muslim and Arab communities are just as American as anyone. They are teachers, doctors, business owners, public servants, lawyers, scientists, and as some have noted today, many have served in the military and lost their lives fighting for this country. As you probably know, I'm proud to be a veteran of the United States Army, and I'm proud to be the incoming chair of the Veterans Committee. I, like many other veterans, question how this ban is likely to make America safer. On the contrary, it's generally agreed among military experts this is more likely to achieve the exact opposite consequence by sending the exact wrong signal during this time of tension and conflict, corroborating the assertions and recruiting efforts of those who argue that the West is indeed hostile to Islam, while stigmatizing and alienating members of our communities who deserve so much better. As an alarming footnote, thousands of Iraqis who worked as interpreters and advisors to U.S. troops are now barred from obtaining visas and entering the country. They now risk retaliation against themselves and their families for assisting the United States government in a time of war. As my seatmate eloquently noted earlier, these interpreters served and protected Americans and have saved American lives from terrorists, and we are now turning our backs on them. This nation, and especially California, has always been a country of immigrants. California's diversity has always been its strength. With 15 million Latino residents and the largest Arab American population residing primarily in Los Angeles and Orange County, immigrants are part of the fabric of America, immigrants that share the same value system that we all believe in. This resolution is about protecting those beliefs and protecting those values, and I urge an aye vote. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Newman. Senator Pan.
Thank you, Madam President, Senators. I rise in strong support of SR 16. I know that my friend from Santa Monica made reference to the fact that these executive orders were actually issued on Holocaust Memorial Day. I'd also note that today is Fred Korematsu Day. Fred Korematsu was a Japanese American who, during World War II, when the President issued Order 9066, for personal reasons, decided that he was not going to go into internment and was eventually caught by the FBI and convicted. There was a case that went all the way up to the Supreme Court, and at the first time around, of course, given the state of fear in the country, the courts decided that he would be upheld his conviction. However, decades later, further evidence came forth showing that the administration at the time did have intent in terms of sort of classifying people by race, Japanese Americans, and he had and the Supreme Court vacated his conviction. Now, we often have ceremonies here where we say never again, where we proclaim that we have achieved greater wisdom in learning the lessons of the past. And it's easy to say these things during times of peace and comfort. The question is, where are our convictions when things aren't quite as comfortable, and where do we stand? And I would also make note that this is not an issue of party or partisanship, because after all, Fred Korematsu was convicted under Order 966 by Democrat President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and the apology was issued by Republican President Ronald Reagan. So I hope that as we're considering this particular resolution, that this is not about, are you Democrat or Republican? or even are you for or against President Trump. It's about the essence of what are we saying and how will history judge us? Will history judge us? Think about the senators and assembly members and the Congress people back before World War II and how we judge them now and their decisions. After all, we wouldn't say detained is kind of, they were really incarcerated a whole group of Japanese Americans, and nothing ever came out of that in terms of sabotage or harm in terms of sabotage or espionage. That where are we going now today? And did we actually learn the lessons of the past? Have we become wiser? And will we stand up for our convictions? And so I urge a yes vote, because I hope that we have become wiser and that we will stand by our convictions and that we have learned the lessons of the past. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Pan. Senator McGuire?
Thank you so much, Madam President. Would like to be able to say thank you to the Pro Tem for advancing this resolution. And I don't know about you, but I was in shock this weekend. I couldn't believe the actions that were playing out in what is the greatest democracy in the world. And I think that all of us would agree that diversity is part of who we are in California and throughout this nation. It's what makes our communities strong, our economy prosper, and it's what distinguishes all of us from everyone else. And what I appreciate about this resolution is that it clearly draws a line in the sand with the ill-conceived executive orders brought forward by President Trump. And the tragically ironic fact about President Trump's dangerous actions is that there has not been one terrorist attack, one, by a refugee from any of the countries listed in the executive order on U.S. soil since the passing of the 1980 Refugee Act. Not one. And that's according to the Cato Institute, hardly a progressive think tank. The president's dangerous executive order would ban all refugees from Iraq and Iran, Syria and Somalia, Sudan, Libya, and Yemen. For what reason? This action, as we've heard from defense experts, puts our brave men and women who are battling for us on foreign soils in harm's way. According to the Cato Institute, the likelihood of being killed by any refugee from any country here in the United States of America is 1 in 3.64 billion. 1 in 3.64 billion. Now, nearly 13,000 people in the United States a year are killed by guns. Where's our outrage about this? The likelihood that this is a slippery slope is a good one. This immigration ban is dangerous, ill-conceived, and given the facts, cannot be justified on a safety risk. And make no doubt about it, it is our time, not just as members of the Senate, but as Americans, to be able to stand strong for our democracy. And I feel very emotional and passionate about it. And we must base our decision in this country not off of hyperbole, but facts, not on religious tests. And that's why I'm going to be supporting SR 16. Thank you, Madam President.
Thank you, Senator McGuire. Senator Stern.
Thank you, Madam President. I rise in support of SR 16. There's very little I can do to add to the eloquence of my colleagues here today, but I rise in support for two reasons. One, because I believe in the Constitution, and as our Judiciary Chair pointed out, this document does not distinguish between party. This document does not recognize politics. In fact, it has survived through generations of political turmoil and remained durable in the face of all the politics of personality that have come to dominate our country over the centuries. But this document has power because a woman in New York a judge in the Eastern District who none of us know, who never ran for office, who was never on a reality show, Ann Donnelly, equipped with the power of this Constitution and the Due Process Clause, can enjoin the President of the United States from enforcing what is against the backbone of this nation. And in that power, in that document, we find some kind of equalizing force here, because might is not always the quality of progress in this nation. And so I rise to recognize the power of that document and the power of this resolution, but those pale in comparison to the power of our people. And so for the second reason, I'd like to point out that, as my colleague Senator Allen mentioned, as a Jew, this does not apply to us, but we all have an obligation not just to stand up for our own, but to stand up for each other. I wanted to read a quote from Martin Niemöller, a Protestant priest who during the Holocaust stood up against Hitler. And he noted that first they came for the socialists. And I did not speak out because I was not a socialist. Then they came for the trade unionists. But I did not speak out because I was not a trade unionist. Then they came for the Jews. And I did not speak out because I am not a Jew. And then they came for me. And there was no one left to speak for me. I think the power of this moment is that we're speaking not for me, not for ourselves, but for each other. And so the brave acts, not just of Democrats in this body or Republicans in this body, but Republicans and Democrats all throughout this country who are rising up and speaking out for everybody, ought to be recognized, and I think is embodied in the spirit of this resolution. And I stand strongly in support and commend the author for bringing it forward.
Thank you, Senator Stern. Senator Glazer.
Thank you, Madam President. Members, I want to first compliment the Pro Tem for bringing this resolution before us. And I wanted to direct my comments to my friends across the aisle, our friends across the aisle. We just came through a very difficult election season, and the partisanship is at a heightened place. And there is a feeling that that contentiousness continues on. And so at a moment like this, we don't have to look at the facts. We can look at maybe the spirit in which you think it was brought before us, or the hyper-partisanship that still envelops us. And there's concern that somehow acts like this, resolutions like this, deal with the issue of the legitimacy of our current president. And for me, and I think for others, that's not a fight that this resolution presents. And it's also not a situation where it's about campaign rhetoric. He said this, she said that. Oh, that was the campaign. Okay, well, those times are done. Those times are beyond us. And I know how difficult it is to speak up or act up against a leader of your own party. We have those issues here in California on our side of the aisle when we speak up against something that the governor has proposed. And you now face that same circumstance where you might not agree with the president of your party, but you feel this pull and this tug that somehow you should defend what he has done, even when you may disagree. And so I'd like to share with you some thoughts from members of your party. Madam President, may I have permission to read?
Without objection.
This is a statement that was issued yesterday by U.S. Senators John McCain and Lindsey Graham, members of your party. And they said this about the executive order in which we debate today. Our government has a responsibility to defend our borders, but we must do so in a way that makes us safer and upholds all that is decent and exceptional about our nation. It is clear from the confusion at our airports across the nation that President Trump's executive order was not properly vetted. We are particularly concerned by reports that this order went into effect with little or no consultation with the Departments of State, Defense, Justice, and Homeland Security. Such a hasty process risks harmful results. We should not stop green card holders from returning to the country they call home. We should not stop those who have served as interpreters for our military and diplomats from seeking refuge in the country they risk their lives to help. And we should not turn our back on those refugees who have been shown through extensive vetting to pose no demonstrable threat to our nation and who have suffered unspeakable horrors, most of them women and children. Ultimately, we fear this executive order will become a self-inflicted wound in the fight against terrorism. At this very moment, American troops are fighting side by side with our Iraqi partners to defeat ISIL. But this executive order bans Iraqi pilots from coming to military bases in Arizona to fight our common enemies. Our most important allies in the fight against ISIL and the vast majority of Muslims who reject this apocalyptic ideology of hatred. This executive order sends a signal, intended or not, that America does not want Muslims coming into our country. That is why we fear this executive order may do more to help terrorist recruitment than improve our security. So do these United States senators want America to be less safe? I don't think so. But these United States senators, as hard as it may be, know that their obligation is to our Constitution and our laws. And that's a very difficult thing to do, especially with a new president. But I do agree with my colleagues that at moments like this, the history will not be written about what just he did. It's about what you do. And these aren't things that you can hide behind because of a convoluted debate about sanctuary cities or about the politics of the presidential election. No, this is your moment. This is your moment. And it will be written into history. And I believe this resolution is deserving of support.
Thank you, Senator Glazer. Senator Portantino.
Thank you, Madam President, and thank you to the Pro Tem for bringing this forward. I'm not an attorney. I'm not a constitutional scholar. I went to public schools where they taught us about the Holocaust, where they taught us about our history, where they taught us about internments. As an Italian American, I should add that there were many Italian Americans who were also interned during World War II through fear. What affects one of us affects all of us. And what struck me today is when I just read in the Wall Street Journal that 100 State Department diplomats have just signed a document protesting this order. And I think about 100 State Department diplomats. Invariably, some of them are Republicans and some of them are Democrats. And so if the State Department diplomats themselves are standing up to an ill-conceived, mean-spirited executive order by the president, so should this body. I want to commend my colleague from Santa Barbara for reading the inscription on the Statue of Liberty, because as my grandparents who came to this country through New York, they were welcomed to this country with open arms. I also am troubled by the religious aspect of the conversation. We tend to wrap things up in religion when we want to. We tend to talk about this, but I don't know, the Bible that I like to read, and in Matthew, I think it's 25, whatever you do for the least of these, you do unto me. I would say the Bible is pretty clear. Whatever you do to the least of these, you do unto me. That's what we should be doing as our country. We should follow through on the lessons we learned in school, on the celebrations of our heritage that we do on this floor, on the history lessons that we were taught never to repeat, and on the values that we were taught to stand for. And I also will commend my colleague from Northern California who talked about this snapshot in history. We do need to make a stand as a state, as a body, and as individuals. And then finally, I would submit that I wonder if Jesus, Mary, and Joseph would be allowed, because they were refugees fleeing oppression, would they be allowed to enter our country as refugees? I just wonder, would they? We'll see how we react. So with that, I add my strong support and voice, not as a constitutional scholar, not as a lawyer, but as somebody who was taught by my mom to know right from wrong, and what's happening in airports around our country is wrong, and this resolution is right, and I urge you to support it.
Thank you, Senator Portantino. Senator Wynn.
Thank you, Madam President. This issue is not a Democrat or a Republican issue. History has shown 40-plus years ago, California elected official who happened to be registered Democrat condemned President Carter and Reagan for allowing Vietnamese refugees like myself to come to this state. And the reason that was cited was for economic reason. As a refugee, this resolution is a very difficult one for me. I was too young back then. I arrived in the United States when I was 5 in '81. So I didn't know about the debate or what was said about us refugees coming from Vietnam. But as I learned the history growing up and hearing and reading of what took place, it made me really sad. My family came to this country seeking refuge from a country engulfed in violence and despair. My father was sought to go to concentration camp, what the communist government called re-education camp, because he served under the former free government of Vietnam. My uncle was executed on the days following the fall of Saigon. So I personally understand the plight of refugees and sympathize with their experiences. But in the end, the debate is about national security. If indeed the goal of this executive order is to address our national security concerns, to protect us as Americans and our daily life without fear of leaving our homes, and as the mom of 2 young children, when I'm up in Sacramento, I fear, could something happen to them at school or at kindergarten or in preschool? That we need to refocus our efforts in strengthening the vetting process for all refugees and protecting Americans. However, in this process, we must also ensure that we adhere to the principles established by our forefathers, those freedoms that our brave servicemen and women, our veterans, like my brother, who served in the United States Marines, who went to Iraq, who was ordered to go to Iraq right after 9/11, who fought for every day around the world for us to enjoy our freedom. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Wynn. Senator Atkins.
Well, thank you, Madam President. You know, I agree with my colleague from La Cañada who, you know, gave his non-credentials, and I'm glad that I got to hear a reminder and refresher on constitutional law, the great words on the Statue of Liberty, Plymouth Rock. But let me just say, this is not a partisan issue. Every member of my family served in the military but me. World War II, Vietnam, Korea. My nephew, 10 years younger than me, just retired after 20 years. He did 2 tours in Iraq. I have Republicans and Democrats in my family. Yesterday, I spent the day at a forum where people were learning their rights. And if this were about vetting, then there's a discussion to be had in the proper way with Congress and the administration as if we don't have a system already in place. We do. We do. And by the way, the people I spent 2 hours with yesterday in City Heights, with people speaking 85 different languages and dialects, certainly people from Somalia and Sudan there, they follow the rules. They've been following the rules. They've been filling out the paperwork. They've been talking to immigration attorneys. They're doing the paperwork. They're cobbling together their precious resources from family. And they're following the rules, and it has taken a long time. This process is not something that happens overnight. It takes years in many cases. And so what do you tell the people who've been following the rules, much like my colleague's family, obviously, to be here in this great country, to have the opportunities that we all want for our own kids? That's what they want. They want safety. They want to come here because they think we're one of the safest countries in the world. They want to be here to have opportunities. You know, and yesterday, I mean, I can't help. I just, you know, I'm not a Democrat or a Republican when it comes to people in need. I focus on emotion. I focus on what my family taught me. And again, my colleague who talked about the lessons he learned in the Bible. I'm pretty sure I just said to my colleague that Jesus, Mary, and Joseph were Middle Eastern. So, you know, what are we doing when we debate some of these things? And really, there is a system in place. People are following the system, and they're being stopped in their tracks. Yesterday, I was touched because in the middle of this 2.5-hour forum, by the way, there were almost 200 people there. There was a teacher who showed up and spent her beautiful Sunday in San Diego at a 2.5-hour session because she teaches kids from Syria who are worried. She's trying to figure out how to help her students be able to pay attention and listen and to learn the thing that their parents want them to be able to do. And in the middle of this 2.5, almost 3-hour session, we had to stop because there were calls to prayer. And the men went one way and the women went another. And friends of this community served us all food because they knew that we were going to be waiting for a little while. You know, I would urge us to really think about an action that it needed to happen so quickly, overnight, to really, really impact so many real people, real people. You know, my chief of staff wouldn't be here today if we hadn't let his mother immigrate 50 years ago. And she lived on beaches, not for fun, but because that's where they had to be while they waited to be processed. And there were hurricanes and typhoons and bad weather. So I ask us to tap into our humanity. We are not suggesting that we lax our national security. In fact, it is stronger than it has ever been. And if there needs to be a national discussion about vetting, let's do it across party lines. Let's do it in the way that our forefathers intended for us to do it, with a dialogue and a discussion about real issues as opposed to perceived threats. I support this resolution. I read every word of it, and I felt compelled to stand mainly because of the emotion I felt yesterday amongst my constituents who were calling out for us to please explain what is happening. Why this all of a sudden? Help us understand what we now need to do. Help us continue to follow the rules, because we will. But don't expect us to expend our precious resources only to be sent back, having spent that money and no longer able to be able to realize the dreams that we have. I support this resolution. Urge an aye vote.
Thank you, Senator Atkins. Senator Mitchell.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. First of all, I want to thank my colleagues from Santa Barbara, Sacramento, all of my colleagues on the floor today for some of the most profound, eloquent floor statements I have heard since coming to this body. This has been a rich, meaningful, informative discussion. I'm proud to have signed on as a co-author of the resolution. And many folks have stood today declaring your shock over the events of this past weekend. But the truth of the matter is, if we were to tell the truth, we're not shocked. We're not shocked at all, because it was forecasted very deliberately months ago about the willful intention of the actions that took place. The question before us is not about shock and awe, but what are we going to do about it? One of my colleagues talked about the heightened partisanship as a result of the national debate. I would take it a step further and suggest that the level of implicit bias is palatable. And if we as a body and a country aren't willing to address that and call a spade, if you will, then we can look forward to 4 years of equally as offensive, inappropriate policies coming before us. I raised an issue about process earlier, and in that same vein, I would say that I would hope that we as a legislative body, at the very least, would respect the value of publicly vetted policymaking process. 14 executive orders in 9 days cannot, regardless of whether you are a supporter of the current administration or not, be done in a thoughtful, deliberate, accurate way. It cannot. We, members of this body, fully understand how public policy we vote on, we introduce, gets better, gets stronger as it goes through the legislative process. And so I'm hopeful that these executive orders that are crafted in the cover of darkness with very little input from the experts whose actual jobs are designed to inform the process aren't being consulted. I hope that I don't have to look forward to 4 more years of, at the speed of light, executive orders circumventing the process being levied upon the heads of Americans. Lastly, I will say I was struck by the use of the pronouns us and we today, because some of us became we and us as Americans more recent than others. And so at what point do you draw the line in the sand and the us and we applies to you and not other people? I am proud to stand up and cast my vote in support of SR 16.
Thank you, Senator Mitchell. Senator Stone.
Thank you, Madam President and colleagues. I've heard from a number of speakers that this was not meant to be political. It should be nonpartisan. But just by virtue of having this resolution, you have in fact made it political. With the criticism of the Trump administration for ordering this executive action and the promptness of it, there was certainly no hesitation to bring this resolution warped to the floor without any consultation in a bipartisan way to try to bring all parties together. And it just seems that there is so much hypocrisy sometimes that comes out of state government. It was President Obama who set the standard for circumventing Congress through his numerous executive actions, and yet we will criticize President Trump for doing the same. The senator from Santa Barbara eloquently said that no one is above the Constitution, and she's absolutely right. Yet, this institution regularly assaults Second Amendment rights with laws that are passed and are challenged by the courts, or challenging our religious rights, our First Amendment rights, by telling religious schools what they can do and can't do. We talk about some of these countries that have been singled out, and the inference is that we are singling them out because they are Muslim countries. What we don't get to see, that the president gets to see, is intelligence briefings. And yes, Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates are allies of the United States, And yes, they have had some members of their community that have caused heinous attacks on the United States. And these wealthy countries that derived a lot of their wealth from their oil reserves over the past 4 or 5 decades, that are in close proximity to the Syrian civil war, where are our allies, where are our partners in providing the humanitarian care to people that live close to them? Let's take a step back from the hysteria and talk about what this executive order does and doesn't do. Is it meant to keep Muslims out of this country, as the pro tem claims? Nowhere in the executive orders are the words Muslim banned used. From CNN today, in December 2015, President Obama signed a law measure placing restrictions on certain travelers who had visited Iran, Iraq, Sudan, or Syria on or after March 1st, 2011. And 2 months later, the Obama administration added Libya, Somalia, and Yemen to the list in what it called an effort to address the growing threat of foreign terrorist fighters from abroad. President Obama did exactly the same thing that the Trump administration is doing, is trying to limit what seems to be working at this time and keeping terrorists that are rampant on the streets in these countries that chant death to America and are willing to strap bombs on themselves and come into this country and kill innocent people. San Bernardino, Orlando, Paris, these are the images that are in the eyes of the American public, in the eyes of the Californian public, in the eyes of Riverside County public. And I know because in my last election I walked and talked, and the number one issue that the citizens brought up to me wasn't about the jobs that we need in the state. Their issue was about their safety. They felt we are prone to a terrorist event in this country. The president's number one goal is to keep this country safe. We saw him take an oath of office on January 20th to make sure that that, in fact, did happen. We talk about due process, but the one thing that this institution fails to want to recognize is the due process that took place on January 20th. We elected, whether you like it or not, Donald Trump to be the 45th president of the United States. His order is temporary and is perfectly legal for the president to order a ban in order to review immigration procedures. It was a hallmark of his campaign where he said, under my administration, we are going to have strong vetting procedures to make sure that those people that want to come in this country to do us harm aren't given that opportunity. All he's doing, my friends, is he's hitting the pause button to do his job for protecting our country in accordance with the oath of office that he took. I applaud our president to err on the side of ensuring that we prevent those that want to cause us harm from entering into this country and getting our policies and procedures at our borders through immigration and naturalization in order. George Bush ordered 6 immigration bans during his tenure as president. President Obama ordered 6 as well. Why were there no resolutions when President Obama did the 6, condemning those executive orders? This resolution makes vague references to terrorists, making this a recruiting tool, although there is no evidence yet to prove that that is true. Are we going to wait for an incident to happen from one of these countries that harbor terrorists to get into this country? Are we going to wait for the incident and have a knee-jerk reaction the way the state legislature usually does? I applaud President Trump for using the prophylactic power of his tenure as president to ensure the safety of this country. We all embrace that America is a nation of immigrants, and as diverse, and yes, we are an inclusive country. We always have been. We continue to take immigrants and those that have political strife from abroad, even though we have a $20 trillion debt, and certainly, again, some of the allies I mentioned before have a better capacity to help in these humanitarian efforts than we do. But we also allow all our presidents, past and present, to pass executive orders to allow for more stringent immigration procedures. How about we start figuring out how we start working with this president instead of condemning him at every turn, and let's focus on the important state issues that our citizens want us to do in improving our economy and jobs and in fixing our broken infrastructure. For these reasons, I highly request a no vote on this resolution.
Thank you, Senator Stone. Senator Dodd?
Yes, Madam President and colleagues, I certainly respect my colleague from Temecula, but I'm not going to get in a point-by-point argument with you on the merits of your arguments, but I believe that my colleagues have adequately addressed each and every one of those comments very, very well. And I think that one may only go back to Ronald Reagan's farewell address as President of the United States. And he was speaking of his vision of a shining city upon a hill. Permission to read?
Without objection.
The phrase shining city upon a hill comes from John Winthrop, who wrote it to describe the America that he imagined. What he imagined was important because he was an early pilgrim, an early freedom man. He journeyed here on what today we'd call a little wooden boat, and like other pilgrims, he was looking for a home that would be free. And Ronald Reagan said, "I've spoken of a shining city all my political life, but I don't know if I ever quite communicated what I saw when I said it. But in my mind, it was a tall, proud city built upon rocks stronger than oceans, windswept, God-blessed, and teeming with people of all kinds, living in harmony and peace, a city with free ports that hummed with commerce and creativity. And if there had to be city walls, the walls had doors, and doors that were open to anyone with the will and the heart to get there. That's how I saw it and how I still see it. I ask for your aye vote.
Thank you, Senator Dodd. Senator Anderson?
I've come a long way on this journey. You know, just a couple short years ago, you all voted on a resolution that I put forward, asking President Obama to lift the amount of visas to allow those who are religiously persecuted to come to our country. And I was very proud of that. And I had a community meeting. And many in my community said, you know, we want to be that beacon. We want to be the light on the hill, as Reagan described, straight from the Bible. And we want people to come here. But you don't live in our neighborhood. And you're not vetting and protecting us. And I didn't take it that seriously because we haven't had a crisis. There hasn't been anything in my district, anything local in that focus. But then later that year, we learned from the FBI and the NSA and others that we weren't vetting those refugees, that coming from this country, from these countries, there was no real vetting going on. Even President Obama said it. And that's why I understood why he most likely was capping the number of visas, because he knew that we weren't providing the level of protection that our citizens deserve. Now, everyone's district is different, and I respect all of you to represent your district to the best of your ability. But I want to take those 90 days. I want to make sure these people are vetted. I want to make sure I've crossed every T, dotted every I, because it's not fair to those refugees that we allow into our country to continue to be terrorized by allowing the terrorists to follow them in to the country and into the communities that they are resettling in. And it's more important, that's not fair to our everyday citizens to put their lives in jeopardy. So we're taking 90 days to look at it and ensure that we're doing everything to the best of our ability. And we saw that as it started, it was fraught with problems. But in the first 48 hours, we've already addressed the green card issue. We've already addressed some of these items. And we're going to get better as we go. But at the end of the day, I'd rather fall on caution than to expose somebody who's left terror to more terror, and to expose people who haven't witnessed terror firsthand to make them a victim. Look, we're all trying to do what's right by our constituents, and I certainly respect your vote today because I know that you're doing best by your constituents. But I've heard my constituents loud and clear, and they're scared, and they just want what I think is fair. A fair process that fully vets the people that come to our country so they can sleep at night knowing that they're not going to be a victim of terrorism. Members, I urge a no vote, but I truly appreciate all the great debate on the floor. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Anderson. Senator Wiener?
Thank you, Madam President. To my friend, the senator from San Diego, I don't think we're pursuing this resolution because of our constituents. This is really about our democratic institutions in this country that are slowly, by this administration, being degraded and torn down. We've seen these completely unconstitutional, horrific executive orders that one by one go after this community and that community. First, Mexicans and Muslims. Now we're hearing rumors about a possible attack on the LGBT community. But it goes beyond these executive orders. While this has all been happening, and we've all justifiably been very focused on protecting our immigrant brothers and sisters, our neighbors, this administration has named a white nationalist to the National Security Agency. They are continuing to try to put the head of one of the largest oil companies in the world in charge of our nation's diplomacy, filling the administration with key environmental agencies, filling these agencies with climate deniers, and having a press operation that uses so-called alternative facts. We are seeing a degradation of democratic institutions in this country, and these executive orders are exactly about that. It's not about one district or one set of constituents. This is about the path of our country and going down a road that, frankly, a lot of us, I think obviously erroneously, thought that could never happen in this country. And so we need to push back by supporting this resolution today and by continuing to fight.
Thank you, Senator Wiener. Seeing no further discussion or debate, Senator De Leon, would you like to close?
Thank you very much, Madam President. And I do want to thank all of my colleagues for the very spirited, for the very heartfelt debate, dialogue, conversation that we just had on the Senate floor. Because this is a debate that would assume that the rest of the state and many throughout the nation are actually witnessing today. I would say the following, that the actions of the president are in fact anti-Muslim. And if they're anti-Muslim, they are un-American. They're un-American. This is, and I like to recognize the senator from Orange County because she is correct. This is a nonpartisan issue. It's not a Democrat or Republican issue. It's not a partisan issue. But it is really important to note that any implication that this is an attack or a personal critique on the President of the United States severely underestimates the gravity and severity of this issue. This is a monumental issue with regards to the democratic principles of the greatest nation in the world. More than ever, America needs its friends and its allies throughout the world. We have already successfully alienated our good friend, our strategic and commercial partner to the south of us, in Mexico. We rely on Mexico on many things. We actually share intelligence with Mexico. I know that for a fact because many of us were actually in the intelligence service unit in Mexico City, and they showed us the collaboration and cooperation between DEA, CIA, the U.S. Marine Corps, Homeland Security. We rely on our friends and neighbors to the south to actually identify, detain, hold, and eventually deport suspected terrorists that come from other parts of the world who eventually want to make their way to the United States of America. If not through the ports of entry, LAX, SFO, Kennedy, LaGuardia, Dallas, Chicago, O'Hare, or elsewhere. But we've successfully alienated our friends. I've had numerous conversations, unofficial conversations, with Canadian officials. They are greatly, greatly concerned about the cozy and close relationship that the president has with the Russians. Why do I say that? Why did they say that, share that with me? They shared that with me because obviously Canada, with its provinces in the north of Canada, they border Russia in the Arctic North. And they feel that their national security may potentially be compromised because of the cozy relationship that the President of the United States has with Russia. This is real. These are real conversations that are actually taking place as we speak today. I know that the Chinese are trying to fill the vacuum as quickly as possible with regards to the lack of leadership globally in the United States of America. And the senator from Santa Monica, and I was going to mention it because Santa Monica, and out of terms of endearment, he referred to Los Angeles as Tehrangeles because it is the capital of the Iranian Persian community outside of Tehran, Iran. And we had so many law-abiding U.S. citizens, legal permanent residents, and it's abhorrent, it's undignified, it's downright disrespectful to the Iranian Persian community to actually be held at LAX International Airport when they've contributed so much to our economy, to our culture, to who we are as a great state. So anything that's anti-Muslim is un-American. That's just the bottom line. I was given a few notes here that I do want to share with regards to perhaps a reference. I didn't have an opportunity to hear that reference with regards to the number of executive orders that have been issued in the past by our former president, President Barack Obama. I think the implication is that this president has issued more orders than any other president, therefore abusing the constitutional powers and abusing, if you will, corroding the lines between the executive and the legislative branch and not choosing to work with the legislative branch and move forward policies in a statutory manner, but rather do so by fiat through the executive level. So according to the Pew Research Center, the president, Barack Obama, our former president, on an average year has issued 35 executive orders. George W. Bush, on an average year, 36 executive orders. Ronald Reagan, 48 executive orders. Gerald Ford, 69 executive orders. Those are the average per year during the course of their presidency. So dialing it back to Barack Obama, 35 executive orders average per year. That's the lowest since President Cleveland at 35. So I don't think when you put this in context and you compare it to all of our presidents, that's an abuse of power. Obviously, in a partisan fashion, no question about, it was very difficult for the president to move forward policies given the paralysis in the Congress. But this is very important to note that we can't alienate our friends globally, and we surely cannot make our country less safe. National security is paramount. I think that trumps, if you will, no pun intended, Democrats and Republicans. Ultimately, we're all Americans, and the national security of our nation is paramount. But we can't do so in a manner that incites others and gives them the pretext and excuse to continue to recruit. Now, I know the senator from Agoura Hills had just recited verbatim Martin Niemöller's famous poem. And just a few days ago, actually, about 3 or 4 days ago, I actually read the poem. I've read it on numerous occasions, as we all have, and we've heard it in many different ways. But I've actually made a few changes to it, because I think it's apropos to the national climate that we're facing here today. First, they came for the Muslims, and I did not speak out, because I was not Muslim. Then they came for the immigrants, and I didn't speak out, because I wasn't an immigrant. Then they came for the teachers, and I didn't speak out because I wasn't a teacher. Then they came for the scientists, but I didn't speak out because I wasn't a scientist. Then they came for the environmentalists, and I didn't speak out because I wasn't an environmentalist. And then they came for the LGBT community. I didn't speak out because I was not a member of the LGBT community. Then they came for the very strong women, and I didn't speak out because I wasn't a strong woman. Then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak for me. The question becomes, to my colleagues in a bipartisan fashion, Democrats and Republicans, is how long will this list be ultimately? How long will this list be ultimately? And I know at the end of the day, it's entirely up to us if we're going to stop that list. It's entirely up to us if we're going to stop that list. Madam President, as well as colleagues, I respectfully ask for a bipartisan vote for SR 16.
Thank you, Senator De Leon. Mr. Secretary, please call the roll.
Allen. Aye. Anderson. No. Atkins. Aye. Bates. No. Bell. Aye. Berryhill. No. Bradford. Aye. Cannella. De Leon. Aye. Dodd. Aye. Fuller. No. Gaines. No. Galgiani. Aye. Glazer. Aye. Hernandez. Aye. Hertzberg. Aye. Hill. Aye. Wesso. Aye. Jackson. Aye. Lada. Aye. Leyva. Aye. McGuire. Aye. Mendoza. Aye. Mitchell. Aye. Monning. Aye. Morlock. No. Morrell. No. Newman. Aye. Wynn. Nilsson. Nilsson, no. Pan. Aye. Portantino. Aye. Roth. Aye. Skinner. Aye. Stern. Aye. Stone. No. Vidak. No. Wykowski. Wiener. Aye. Wilk. No.
Please call the absent members.
Cannella. Wynn. Wykowski.
Ayes 26, noes 11. The measure passes. Members, we are going to move to motions and resolutions. This would be the appropriate time to do adjourn in memories, and it would be appropriate to do them on Thursday if you so wish. Senator Morrell, for what purpose do you rise?
Adjourn in memory?
Please proceed.
Thank you very, very much. Thank you, Madam President. I rise today, if you remember Senator Bob Dutton, his